On the morning of October 11th, 1927, the port of Genoa woke to the low bellow of a ship's horn. The Principessa Mafalda sat at her berth, engines quiet, gangways down. She was beautiful. 9,200 tons, a 2-story ballroom, crystal chandeliers from Murano, marble columns, French velvet. She had cost 2.4 million lire to build, $80 million in today's money. For nearly 2 decades, she had been the finest ship on the South American run. Genoa to Buenos Aires, month after month, year after year. They called her the Pride of Italy. But by the time she left port that day, something had already changed. The captain had sent 2 telegrams. The crew whispered about sounds below deck. The maintenance logs had gaps. And 4 days later, in calm water, 75 miles from shore, with rescue ships watching, she would disappear beneath the surface. They called her the Italian Titanic. We're going to cover everything. The luxury, the passengers, the warnings that were ignored, the hours between the first crack and the final silence. And the question no one wants to answer: what really sank her? The sea, or the men who sent her there? The Mafalda was launched in 1908 in the shipyards of Glasgow, built by Robert Napier and Sons for the Navigazione Generale Italiana. She was 9,200 tons, 148 meters long, 17 meters wide, twin screws, triple expansion engines. She could carry 1,200 passengers across 3 classes, plus 280 crew. She was not the largest ship on the Atlantic, but for nearly 2 decades, she was the finest on the South American run. Genoa to Rio, Rio to Montevideo, Montevideo to Buenos Aires, and back. 28 days round trip. Month after month, year after year. She was named after Princess Mafalda of Savoy, the second daughter of King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, a woman who, by the time the ship sank, had already begun her own slow descent into tragedy. She would die in a Nazi concentration camp in 1944. Buchenwald. The Italians, superstitious as they are, would later whisper that the ship and the princess shared a curse. But curses are just another name for neglect. The Mafalda's first-class accommodations were designed to impress, to seduce. A 2-story ballroom, with coffered ceilings and crystal chandeliers imported from Murano. A grand staircase of polished teak with bronze railings spiraling down 3 decks. Marble columns in the dining saloon. Louis XVI furniture upholstered in French velvet. Mirrors framed in gold leaf. A smoking room paneled in mahogany, with deep leather armchairs and a bar stocked with Piedmontese vermouth and Argentine wine. The first-class cabins had private bathrooms, a rarity in 1908. Porcelain sinks, brass fixtures, curtains embroidered with the house crest. There was a library with 300 volumes in Italian, Spanish, and French. A children's playroom with rocking horses and toy ships. A promenade deck shaded by canvas awnings where passengers could take their morning coffee while watching the Atlantic churn below. The ship cost 2.4 million lire to build. In today's money, somewhere near $80 million. She was not a liner for crossing the ocean quickly. She was a liner for crossing it beautifully. But by 1927, the beauty had faded in places you could not see from the promenade. The boilers were 19 years old. The engines had been overhauled twice, but not recently. The refrigeration system broke down so often that the kitchen staff had learned to cook with spoiled meat and hope no one noticed. The lifeboats hung in their davits. Yes, but some of the canvas was rotting. Some of the oars were cracked. There were rumors among the crew that the watertight doors no longer sealed properly, that the bilge pumps wheezed when they ran, that the hull plating near the shaft tunnels had thinned from years of vibration and salt. But rumors do not stop sailings. Schedules do. And the Mafalda had a schedule to keep. On this final voyage, she carried 971 passengers. 288 crew. The passengers were a cross-section of two worlds. In first class, Argentine landowners returning from European holidays, Spanish industrialists, an Italian countess traveling to visit her daughter in Buenos Aires, a Brazilian diplomat, a priest from the Vatican traveling to conduct Mass in Montevideo, families with nannies and steamer trunks full of evening gowns and top hats. In second class, merchants and minor officials, shopkeepers, a magician hired to perform at a theater in Rio. In third class, the emigrants, farmers from Calabria, laborers from Sicily, families with everything they owned wrapped in cloth bundles. They paid less than the cost of a first-class dinner for a bunk in a shared cabin and a bowl of pasta twice a day. They slept 4 to a room, sometimes 6. The air below deck smelled of sweat and garlic and engine oil, but they did not complain. They were going to Argentina, to a new life. The Mafalda was not luxury to them. It was passage. The ship also carried cargo, 250,000 lire in gold coin, destined for the Argentine Central Bank, mail sacks bound for Rio and Montevideo, crates of Italian wine, bolts of silk, machine parts, olive oil in amphora-shaped tins, a grand piano for a concert hall in Buenos Aires. The cargo was loaded last, stacked in the forward holds, and lashed down with rope. The gold was placed in the ship's safe, in a locked cabin on the main deck. 2 stewards were assigned to guard it in shifts. No one expected trouble. No one ever does. Captain Simon Gulli was 53 years old. He had been with Navigazione Generale Italiana for 22 years. He had commanded the Mafalda for 6. He was a small man, lean, with a narrow mustache and deep-set eyes. He spoke little. He drank espresso in the chart room and smoked thin cigars on the bridge wing and kept a leather-bound log in his cabin where he recorded the ship's position every 4 hours in his own hand. He was respected. Not loved, but respected. The crew called him the Old Man, though he was not particularly old. He was simply the kind of man who had always seemed old. Steady, methodical, a man who did what he was told, and told others to do the same. On the morning of October 11th, he stood on the bridge and watched the last passengers board, and wondered privately if the ship would make it to Buenos Aires. He had sent a telegram to the company headquarters the week before. Request replacement vessel. Mafalda machinery unreliable. Advise. The reply had come the next day. Continue to Rio. No replacements available. So he continued. The Mafalda left Genoa at 12:15 in the afternoon, 4 hours late. The delay was attributed to engine repairs. No details were provided. The passengers, most of whom had been waiting on the pier since dawn, were irritable but patient. Delays were common. Ships were machines. Machines broke. The important thing was that they were moving now. The tugs pulled the Mafalda into the harbor. The engines turned over with a low metallic growl. The propellers bit into the water. The ship began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The passengers lined the rails and waved to the crowd on the pier. Handkerchiefs fluttered. A band played a waltz. Streamers unspooled in the wind, red and green and white, the colors of Italy. Children shouted. Women cried. Men stood with their hands in their pockets and watched the coast recede and wondered if they would ever see it again. The Mafalda turned southwest into the open sea, and Genoa became a smudge of gray on the horizon, and then nothing. For the first few days, life aboard the Mafalda followed the rhythms that had been established over 19 years. Breakfast in the dining saloon at 8, bouillon on deck at 11, lunch at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 7. The first-class passengers dressed for dinner. The men in black tie. The women in gowns with seed pearls and ostrich feathers. The dining saloon glittered. The chandeliers swayed gently with the roll of the ship. The waiters, in white jackets with gold buttons, moved between the tables with trays of antipasti and roasted lamb and lemon sorbet. The wine was Italian. The conversation was polyglot: Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese. Laughter echoed off the marble. In third class, the dining was simpler. Long tables, tin plates, pasta with tomato sauce, bread, wine in clay pitchers. The emigrants ate quickly and went back on deck to smoke and play cards and watch the sea. There was no entertainment for them, no band, no salon. Just the open sky and the endless water and the knowledge that every hour brought them closer to Argentina. But beneath the routine, there were disturbances, small things. Things you might not notice unless you were paying attention. The ship stopped twice in the first 3 days, once off the coast of Barcelona for 2 hours. Engine trouble again, once in the open Atlantic, south of Portugal, this time for 5 hours. The crew offered no explanation. The passengers waited. Some complained. Most did not. Ships broke down. It was normal. But the stops were becoming more frequent. The food in the dining saloon began to spoil. The refrigeration system had failed somewhere between Genoa and Barcelona. The kitchen staff tried to mask it. They cooked the meat longer. They added more spices. But passengers began to notice a faint smell, a strange texture. Several people became ill, vomiting, diarrhea. The ship's doctor, a young man from Naples, treated them with bismuth and rest and said it was seasickness. But it was not seasickness. It was food poisoning. The crew knew. The officers knew. Captain Gully knew. But no one said anything. To admit the refrigeration had failed would be to admit the ship was not seaworthy, and the Mafalda was scheduled to arrive in Rio on October 27th. There was no time for repairs. On October 20th, the ship reached the Cape Verde Islands and stopped to take on coal. Captain Gully sent another telegram. Machinery deteriorating. Request permission to delay voyage for inspection. The reply came within hours. Continue to Rio. He stood on the bridge and read the telegram twice. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and said nothing. The coal was loaded. The Mafalda departed. Southwest. Into the tropics. The passengers, for the most part, were unaware. They danced in the ballroom to a small orchestra. Violin, cello, piano. The magician performed card tricks in the second-class lounge and made children laugh. The priest held a small morning mass in the first-class salon. 20 people attended, mostly older women. They sang hymns in Italian. The Argentine families gathered on deck in the afternoons and spoke about their estates and the harvest and the price of beef. The emigrants stayed below or sat on the aft deck and mended clothes and told stories about the villages they had left behind. There was a kind of peace, the false peace that comes before disaster. The ship moved through the water. The engines turned. The sea was calm. The sky was blue. Everything seemed fine. But the Mafalda was not fine. She was dying. Slowly. Quietly. In ways that could not be seen from the promenade deck, or the dining saloon, or the bridge. Deep in her hull, in the shaft tunnel, the starboard propeller shaft was vibrating. It had been vibrating for weeks, maybe months. The bearings were worn. The alignment was off. Every rotation sent a shiver through the tunnel. Metal grinding against metal. The vibration was slight. You could feel it if you stood in the engine room and placed your hand on the bulkhead. A faint tremor. The engineers felt it. They mentioned it to the chief engineer, Silvio Scarabicchi. He mentioned it to the captain. The captain mentioned it to the company. The company said, continue to Rio. On the afternoon of October 25th, 1927, the Principessa Mafalda was 75 miles off the coast of Brazil. The nearest port was Salvador, in the state of Bahia. The weather was clear. The sea was calm. The temperature was 28 degrees Celsius, hot. The passengers were on deck, fanning themselves with folded newspapers, drinking iced tea, watching the horizon. It was 5:15 in the afternoon. The sun was still high. The ship was making 12 knots. And then, deep below the waterline, in the starboard shaft tunnel, something broke. The sound was a thud. Not loud, not an explosion, just a heavy, dull thud like a hammer striking an iron plate. The passengers on deck barely noticed. A few looked up. Most did not. But in the engine room, the engineers knew immediately. The starboard shaft had fractured. The propeller, still spinning at full speed, tore free. The shaft, no longer restrained, whipped backward and punched through the tunnel wall. A 10-inch hole. Jagged. The sea poured in. Not a trickle. A torrent. The engine room flooded in minutes. The generators shorted. The lights flickered. The pumps failed. The engineers scrambled up the ladders, shouting. The watertight doors were supposed to close automatically. Some did, some did not. Years of salt and rust had jammed the mechanisms. Water spread through the bilge, through the sewage system, up into the lower cabins. Passengers in third class saw water bubbling up through the drains in the floor, rising, fast. On the bridge, Captain Gully received the report at 5:20. He did not panic. He had been at sea for 30 years. He had seen ships damaged before. He ordered the port engine stopped. He ordered the radio operator to send a distress signal. CQD, the old code, not SOS. The Mafalda was Italian. She used the old code. The message went out. Principessa Mafalda, position 17 degrees south, 37 degrees west. Shaft failure. Taking water. Require assistance. The nearest ship was the British liner Empire Star, 40 miles to the north. She responded within minutes. On our way. Estimate arrival 1 hour. There was also a Dutch freighter, the Alhena, 60 miles to the south. She turned and began steaming toward the Mafalda at full speed. Captain Gully believed the ship would stay afloat. The hole was below the waterline, yes, but the Mafalda had watertight compartments. She could survive flooding in 2, maybe 3 compartments. He ordered the crew to uncover the lifeboats, as a precaution. He told the passengers there was no danger, just a mechanical problem. Help was on the way. The passengers believed him. Why wouldn't they? The sun was shining. The sea was calm. The ship was barely listing. It felt like a delay, like the delays in Genoa and Barcelona. Annoying, but not dangerous. But the water kept rising. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the Principessa Mafalda had developed a list to port. 5 degrees. Not severe, but noticeable. Chairs in the dining saloon slid towards the windows. Passengers walking on deck felt the slope beneath their feet. The ship was no longer moving forward. She was drifting, turning slowly in a wide circle, pushed by the current, and the last momentum of her single working propeller now stopped. From the bridge, Captain Gully could see the sun lowering towards the horizon. He could see passengers gathering on the boat deck, clutching life jackets, watching the crew work the davits. He could see the ocean, flat and blue and indifferent. And he could feel, through the soles of his shoes, the ship settling lower in the water. The flooding was worse than the engineers had reported. The shaft tunnel was completely submerged. The engine room was waist deep. The water had spread aft, into the coal bunkers, and forward into the cargo holds. It was also rising through the sewage system, a design flaw no one had anticipated. Toilets in the third-class cabins gurgled and overflowed, sinks filled with seawater. Passengers fled their cabins, confused and frightened, dragging children and bundles of belongings up the narrow staircases. The crew tried to maintain order, but many of them were just as confused. No one had drilled for this. The last lifeboat drill had been in Genoa weeks ago, and it had been cursory. A demonstration. A few crew members lowering an empty boat halfway down the side of the ship and then raising it again. The passengers had watched from the railings, bored. Now, those same passengers were lining up beside the lifeboats, and the crew were realizing that half of them did not know how to operate the davits properly. The Mafalda carried lifeboats for 1,200 people. 20 boats in total, 10 on each side. They hung in their davits, covered with canvas tarps that had been tied down with rope. The crew removed the tarps. They swung the boats out over the rails. They began to load passengers, women and children first. That was the rule. It had been the rule since the Titanic, 15 years earlier. But the Mafalda was not sinking like the Titanic. She was not sinking fast. She was sinking slowly, incrementally. And that slowness created a strange kind of confusion, a cognitive dissonance. The ship was clearly in trouble, but she did not feel doomed. Not yet. The sun was still shining. The air was warm. Rescue ships were on the way. Some passengers refused to board the lifeboats. They did not want to leave the ship. It felt safer to stay aboard. Larger, more stable. Why climb into a small wooden boat and row away from a 9,000-ton liner that was still afloat? It made no sense, so they stayed. They stood on deck with their arms crossed and watched others leave and assumed quietly that they were making the smarter choice. The first lifeboat was lowered at 6:30. It held 42 people, mostly women and children from first class. A few crew members to row. The boat reached the water without incident. The falls were released. The crew began to row toward the Empire Star, now visible on the horizon, her lights beginning to glow in the twilight. The second boat followed, then the third. The evacuation was proceeding, slowly but proceeding. Captain Gully stood on the bridge wing with a megaphone and called down instructions to the deck officers. Port side first, starboard side hold. He wanted to load the port boats while the ship still had enough list to make launching easier. If the list increased, the starboard boats would swing too far from the hull. They would be harder to board, harder to lower. He was trying to think ahead, trying to manage the disaster in stages. But the sea does not care about stages. At 7 o'clock, the Mafalda's generators failed completely. The lights went out. Not all at once. They dimmed first, flickering like candles in a draught, and then they died. The ship was plunged into darkness. The sun had set 10 minutes earlier. The sky was deep blue, fading to black. There was no moon. The only light came from the stars, and from the lanterns the crew had begun to distribute on deck. Oil lanterns, flashlights. The passengers, many of whom had been standing calmly in line, began to panic. Darkness changes everything. It makes the abstract real. The ship was sinking. They could feel it now. The list had increased to 10 degrees. The deck was slanting. The sea was rising up the hull. You could hear it. A hissing, gurgling sound. Water flooding through portholes that had been left open in the heat of the afternoon. Water pouring into cabins, into corridors. The ship was dying, and now they could hear it. The panic began on the starboard side. A crowd of third-class passengers, mostly men, had been waiting near lifeboat number 14. They had been told to wait. The starboard boats were not being loaded yet, but in the darkness they could not see what was happening on the port side. They could not see the boats being lowered. They only knew the ship was sinking, and they were still on it. Someone shouted. Someone pushed. The crowd surged forward. The crew tried to hold them back, but there were too many. 50 men, maybe 60, rushed the lifeboat. They climbed over the railings. They shoved each other aside. The boat was designed to hold 50 people. It now held 70. The crew, overwhelmed, began to lower it anyway. The davits creaked. The ropes groaned. The boat descended unevenly, tilting, the bow dropping faster than the stern. At 10 feet above the water, one of the falls snapped. The boat flipped. 70 people were thrown into the sea. Some could swim, most could not. The screaming started then, high and thin and terrible, the kind of sound that carries over water. On the port side, the evacuation continued, but the lifeboats were in worse condition than anyone had realized. Lifeboat number 6, loaded with 30 women and children, began to leak as soon as it touched the water. The canvas hull had rotted, the seams had split, water poured in through the bottom. The passengers bailed with their hands, with shoes, with anything they could find, but the boat was sinking faster than they could bail. A crew member stood and waved a lantern, shouting for help. The Empire Star, now less than a mile away, saw the signal and launched one of her own boats. The British sailors rowed hard, pulled alongside, and transferred the passengers one by one. The Italian lifeboat sank 10 minutes later. Empty. Just another piece of debris in the dark. The Empire Star had arrived at 7:45. She was a British cargo passenger liner, 6,000 tons, en route from Liverpool to Buenos Aires. Her captain, a man named John Edwards, had received the distress call 2 hours earlier and had pushed his engines to full speed. Now he stood on his bridge and looked at the Mafalda through binoculars and understood immediately that this was going to be worse than he had hoped. The Italian liner was listing badly. Her decks were crowded with people. Lifeboats were being lowered, but not quickly enough. Some were already in the water, drifting, half full. He could see lights moving on the Mafalda's deck, lanterns, flashlights, and he could hear, even from a distance, the sound of shouting. He ordered his crew to prepare to receive survivors. He ordered the ship's boats launched. He moved the Empire Star as close as he dared, 200 yards off the Mafalda's port side, and then stopped. He could not go closer. If the Italian ship's boilers exploded, the blast could damage his own vessel. He had his own passengers to protect. So he waited, and his crew rowed out into the darkness to pull people from the water. The Dutch freighter Alhena arrived at 8:15. She was smaller than the Empire Star, 4,000 tons. A cargo ship with minimal passenger accommodation. But her captain, a man named van der Linden, did not hesitate. He brought the Alhena in close, closer than the Empire Star, and lowered his boats. The Dutch sailors rowed through the debris field, searching for survivors. They found them clinging to deck chairs, to cargo crates, to pieces of shattered lifeboat. They found bodies too, floating face down, life jackets keeping them buoyant. The sailors pulled the living into their boats and left the dead. There was no time, no room. The living came first. On the Mafalda, the remaining crew were working desperately to launch the last boats. But the list had increased to 15 degrees. The starboard boats were now hanging several feet away from the hull, swinging in empty air. Passengers trying to board had to leap across the gap. Some made it, some did not. An older woman, a countess from Milan, missed the edge of the boat and fell. 30 feet. She hit the water and did not surface. A priest, Father Domenico from the Vatican delegation, climbed into lifeboat number 18 and then climbed back out. He returned to the deck to help others board. He was seen moving through the crowd, blessing people, helping children into the boats, and then he disappeared. His body was never found. The ship's radio operators, 2 young men named Luigi Reschia and Angelo Boldracchi, stayed at their posts. The radio room was on the upper deck, near the bridge. It still had battery power. They sent message after message. Updates to the Empire Star. Distress calls to any ship in range. Requests for more help. The water was rising through the ship. They could hear it below them, flooding the crew quarters, the galley, the cargo holds. At 9:30, they sent their final message. Mafalda sinking fast. Require immediate assistance all ships. Then the batteries died. The radio went silent. Reschia and Boldracchi left the radio room and went to the boat deck. There were no lifeboats left on the port side. They went to starboard. There was one boat remaining. It was already full. Over capacity. They did not try to board. They stood at the railing and waited. When the ship went down, they went down with it. The Italian government awarded them both the gold medal for civic valor, posthumously. Captain Gully was still on the bridge. He had been there for 4 hours. He had not eaten. He had not sat down. He stood at the forward windows and watched his ship die. The bow was low now. The water was over the foredeck. The forward cargo hatches were submerged. The ship was settling by the head, a slow, awful tilt that you could feel in your bones. He had done what he could. He had ordered the distress calls. He had organized the evacuation. He had kept the crew working. But it had not been enough. 300 people were still aboard, maybe more. He could see them on the aft deck, crowded together, holding onto the railings. Some were praying. Some were weeping. Some were just standing, silent, waiting. He lifted the megaphone and called down to them. Remain calm. Help is here. You will be saved. He did not believe it, but he said it anyway, because that is what a captain does. Chief Engineer Silvio Scarabicchi was also still aboard. He had left the engine room when the water reached his chest. He had come up to the boat deck, soaked and shaking, and had stood near the forward funnel, watching the evacuation. He was 50 years old. He had been with Navigazione Generale Italiana for 18 years. He had maintained the Mafalda's engines. He had signed off on the inspections. He had told the company the ship was seaworthy, and now she was sinking. He knew why. He knew the shaft had been failing for months. He knew the bearings were worn. He knew the watertight doors were unreliable. He had known, and he had said nothing. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a revolver, a small pistol. He had carried it for years. For pirates, he said, for emergencies. A steward saw him and ran over, shouting, reaching for the gun. Scarabicchi stepped back. He put the barrel under his chin. The steward was still reaching when the shot rang out. Scarabicchi fell. The steward knelt beside him, but there was nothing to be done. The chief engineer was dead. His body was left on the deck. There was no time to move it. The ship was sinking. The Mafalda's final hour was chaos. Lifeboats that had already been launched were returning to pick up more passengers, but the ship was listing so badly now that it was almost impossible to bring a boat alongside. The hull was slick with oil and seaweed. The ropes were tangled. Passengers were jumping from the rails, dropping 15, 20 feet into the water, hoping to swim to a lifeboat or to a piece of wreckage. Some made it, some did not. The water was warm, but the sea at night is disorienting. Dark. Infinite. You cannot tell which direction is which. You cannot see the boats. You can only hear voices, distant and distorted, calling out in Italian and Spanish and Portuguese. You swim toward them, or you think you do. But sound moves strangely over water. You swim, and the voices never get closer. There were reports of sharks. Several survivors mentioned them later. Dark shapes moving beneath the surface. A fin. A sudden pull on a leg. A scream cut short. Whether the sharks were real or imagined is unclear. The waters off Brazil are home to bull sharks and tiger sharks, both of which are known to attack humans. But in the darkness, in the chaos, it is difficult to say what people actually saw. Fear has a way of inventing monsters, but fear also has a way of seeing what is really there. At 9:45, the Mafalda's bow was completely submerged. The forward funnel was tilting. The ship was going down by the head, the stern rising slowly out of the water. Passengers still on deck were sliding forward, grabbing at railings, at ropes, at anything that would hold them. Some let go. They fell into the sea. Others held on. The ship's orchestra, 3 men who had been playing waltzes in the ballroom just hours earlier, were seen standing near the aft deck house. They were not playing. They had left their instruments below. They were just standing, waiting. One of them, the violinist, was smoking a cigarette. The image stayed with several survivors. A man in a bow tie, standing on a sinking ship, smoking as if he were waiting for a train. At 10 o'clock, the water reached the bridge. Captain Gully had been standing at the forward rail, watching the bow disappear. He had sent the last of the deck officers away. He was alone. He took a cigarette from his jacket pocket. A thin cigar, actually. Italian. He lit it with a match, cupping his hands against the wind. There was no wind. The sea was calm. But the habit remained. He stood and smoked and watched the water rise over the foredeck, over the cargo hatches, over the anchor chains. The ship groaned. A deep metallic sound. The sound of steel bending, of rivets popping, of a structure that had held together for 19 years, finally giving up. He finished the cigarette. He dropped it into the water at his feet. He straightened his cap. He saluted the flag, still flying from the mast above him. And then the bridge went under, and he went with it. At 10:03, the Principessa Mafalda's stern rose out of the water. The propellers, bronze and barnacled, were visible in the starlight. The rudder hung in the air. The aft decks emptied as passengers and crew slid forward or jumped. The ship hung there, vertical, for nearly a minute. And then she slipped beneath the surface. Stern first. There was no explosion, no dramatic eruption of steam. Just a long, low hiss as the air trapped inside escaped through hatches and portholes and broken windows. The water frothed. The debris field spread. And then there was silence. The kind of silence that comes after something enormous has ended. The survivors in the lifeboats sat and stared at the empty water. Some wept, some prayed, some said nothing. The Mafalda was gone. The Empire Star's lifeboats worked through the night. Back and forth across the debris field, lanterns held high, voices calling out in English and broken Italian. "Anyone there? Call out! We're here to help!" The sea was crowded with wreckage, deck chairs, cargo crates, steamer trunks bobbing half submerged, their contents spilling out like the intestines of some gutted animal. Clothes, photographs, a child's doll floating face down. The boats moved slowly, carefully, the sailors rowing in silence, listening. You could hear the survivors before you could see them. Voices in the darkness, some calling for help, some calling names. Maria, Giuseppe, Madre, some just moaning. The sound of people too exhausted to shout, clinging to wreckage, waiting. The Dutch sailors from the Alhina were pulling bodies from the water. Some were alive, some were not. It was difficult to tell in the darkness. A man floating in a life jacket, head back, eyes closed. You called to him. No response. You rowed closer. You reached out and touched his shoulder. Sometimes he gasped and opened his eyes. Sometimes he did not. The living were hauled into the boats. The dead were left behind. There was no choice. The boats could only hold so many. You saved who you could and moved on. The sailors did not speak. They rowed, they pulled, they rowed again. Methodical, efficient, refusing to think too much about what they were doing. Because if you thought about it, you would stop. And if you stopped, more would die. By midnight, the Empire Star had taken aboard 420 survivors. The Alhina had taken 210. Other ships had arrived. A French cargo steamer, the Formose. An American freighter, the Mosella. A Brazilian coastal vessel, the Colon. They circled the debris field, launching boats, searching. The rescue operation had become a small fleet. 7 ships, 30 lifeboats, hundreds of sailors working under lantern light, searching a patch of ocean several miles wide. The survivors were brought aboard the rescue ships and given blankets and water and hot coffee. Some were injured, broken bones from falling. cuts from debris, burns from scalding steam that had erupted when the boilers flooded. The ship's doctors worked through the night, setting fractures, stitching wounds, treating shock. The dead were laid out on deck, covered with canvas tarps. By dawn, there were 73 bodies on the Empire Star alone. The survivors sat on the decks, wrapped in blankets, shivering despite the warmth. Shock does that. It disconnects the body from the environment. You are cold even when the air is warm. You cannot stop shaking. You cannot speak. Some of the survivors were silent, staring. Others could not stop talking. They told their stories over and over, to anyone who would listen. How they had been in their cabin when the lights went out. How they had climbed the stairs in darkness. How they had jumped from the deck and swum through oil and wreckage and bodies. How they had clung to a crate for 3 hours before a boat found them. The stories poured out, frantic and repetitive, as if the telling could make sense of what had happened, as if words could organize the chaos into something comprehensible. But there was no sense to be made. The ship had sunk. People had died. That was all. Among the survivors was a magician named Giulio Bellini. He had been performing in the second-class lounge earlier that evening. Card tricks, disappearing coins, simple illusions to entertain children. When the lights went out, he had stayed on deck, helping passengers into lifeboats, making jokes, trying to keep people calm. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll make the water disappear." Nobody laughed, but his presence helped. A small man in a tuxedo, smiling, acting as if everything were normal. He was one of the last to leave the ship. He jumped from the rail just before the stern went under and swam to a lifeboat. He was pulled aboard, soaking wet, still wearing the tuxedo. When he reached the Empire Star, he was asked how he had survived. He shrugged. "A magician never reveals his secrets." The British sailors loved him for that. It was a ridiculous thing to say. But ridiculousness, in the face of horror, is a kind of courage. There was also a young Italian woman named Teresa Lombardi, 22 years old, emigrating to Argentina to marry a man she had never met, an arranged marriage. Her family in Calabria had made the arrangements. She had boarded the Mafalda with a trunk full of linens and lace and a photograph of her future husband, a man with a mustache and serious eyes. She had been in a third-class cabin with 3 other women when the ship began to list. They had fled to the deck together, holding hands, terrified. When the lifeboats filled, they had jumped into the water. Teresa could not swim. She clung to a piece of wood, kicking, gasping, swallowing seawater. One of the other women tried to help her but was pulled under by the current. Teresa never saw her again. She floated for 2 hours before a French sailor pulled her into a lifeboat. When she reached the Formose, she was still clutching the photograph. Soaked. Ruined. The ink had run. You could not see the man's face anymore. Just a dark smudge. She sat on the deck and wept. Not for the man she would never marry. For the woman who had tried to save her. The first-class passengers had not fared well. 52% of them died. This was higher than the death rate in steerage, which was 28%. The reason, survivors later speculated, was behavioral. Many of the first-class passengers were older, wealthier, accustomed to being helped, not helping themselves. When the ship began to sink, they waited. They waited for crew to assist them. They waited for instructions. They stood on deck in their evening clothes, calm and composed, certain that someone would take care of them. And by the time they realized no one was coming, it was too late. The lifeboats were gone. The ship was sinking. They jumped into the water in gowns and dinner jackets, weighed down by pearls and pocket watches, and the assumption that the world would catch them. It did not. The Countess Maria Sabato de Montefusco was found floating face down, her life jacket tangled in a rope. She was 63. She had been traveling to Buenos Aires to visit her daughter. She had dined in the first-class saloon that final evening. Lamb and asparagus and champagne. She had danced a waltz. She had retired to her cabin at 9, just before the power failed. She had dressed carefully for the evacuation. A wool coat, a hat with a veil, gloves. She had walked to the boat deck with her hands folded, as if attending a garden party. She had waited in line, and when the line dissolved into chaos, she had simply stood there, unsure what to do. A steward had tried to help her into a lifeboat, but she had refused. "I will wait for the next one," she said. There was no next one. Her body was recovered by the Alhina at 3 in the morning. She was still wearing the gloves. By dawn on October 26th, the search was winding down. The rescue ships had been combing the debris field for 7 hours. The sun rose at 6:15, and with the light came a clearer picture of the disaster. The sea was scattered with wreckage for miles. Lifeboats, some overturned, some half sunk. Cargo crates, furniture, bodies. So many bodies. The sailors continued to search, but they were finding fewer survivors now. Mostly they were finding the dead. They pulled them from the water and laid them on deck and covered them and moved on. By 8 o'clock, the captains of the rescue ships conferred by signal lamp and agreed to end the search. There was no one left to find. The living had been saved. The dead were beyond help. The ships turned toward the Brazilian coast. Rio de Janeiro was 200 miles south. They would arrive by evening. The death toll was 314. This was confirmed over the following days as the rescue ships compiled passenger lists and cross-referenced survivors. Some bodies were never found. Some survivors died later, from injuries or shock. The final count remained uncertain for weeks, but 314 became the accepted number. It was, at the time, the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Italian history. Worse than the sinking of the Sirio in 1906, which had killed 242. Worse than any accident in the Italian merchant fleet. The newspapers called it a national tragedy, a catastrophe, the Italian Titanic. The news reached Italy on the morning of October 26th. The first reports were fragmentary. A brief telegram from the Empire Star to the British consul in Rio, forwarded to Rome. Italian liner Mafalda sunk, heavy loss of life. Survivors en route Rio. The Italian government scrambled for details. How many dead? How many saved? What had happened? The answers came slowly over the next several days as the rescue ships docked in Rio and the survivors were interviewed. The story emerged in pieces. A broken propeller shaft, flooding, a slow evacuation, panic in the dark. A ship that sank stern first under a clear sky while rescue vessels watched. It was almost incomprehensible. The Mafalda had not hit an iceberg. She had not struck a reef. She had not been torpedoed. She had simply broken. A mechanical failure. A maintenance issue. And 314 people had died because of it. In Buenos Aires, the news caused panic. Thousands of Italian and Argentine families had relatives aboard the Mafalda. The passenger list was not immediately available. No one knew who had survived. Crowds gathered at the offices of Navigazione Generale Italiana, demanding information. The company had none. They waited, like everyone else, for the rescue ships to arrive in Rio. When the first survivor lists were posted on October 27th, the crowd surged. Women wept. Men shouted. Some fainted. The lists were incomplete. Names were misspelled. The chaos was unbearable. Families that found their loved ones' names on the survivor list collapsed in relief. Families that did not fell into despair. The Italian consulate in Buenos Aires was overwhelmed. They opened a crisis center. They sent telegrams to Rome. They begged for more information. But the information came slowly. Too slowly. For 3 days, Argentina was in mourning, not knowing who had been lost. The survivors arrived in Rio de Janeiro on the evening of October 26th. The Empire Star docked first, followed by the Alhina and the Formose. The port was crowded with journalists, diplomats, and aid workers. The Brazilian government had sent doctors and nurses. The Italian consul was there, along with representatives from the Argentine and Spanish embassies. The survivors disembarked slowly. Many were injured. Some were carried on stretchers. Others walked, limping, wrapped in blankets, staring at the ground. They were taken to hospitals and hotels. The Italian consulate arranged for temporary housing. The Brazilian Red Cross provided food and clothing. The dead were taken to a morgue. They were laid out in rows. Family members were allowed to view the bodies, to identify them. It was a grim, quiet process. The smell of seawater and decay. The sight of faces you had known, now grey and still. The Italian government launched an official inquiry within 48 hours. A board of naval officers and marine engineers was convened in Rome. They interviewed survivors. They reviewed the ship's maintenance records. They examined the Mafalda's design plans. The investigation took 3 months. The findings were damning. The propeller shaft had fractured due to prolonged mechanical stress and insufficient maintenance. The bearings had not been replaced in 5 years. The shaft alignment had been off for at least 6 months. The watertight doors had failed because the seals were corroded and the mechanisms were jammed with rust. The lifeboats had been poorly maintained. Some were rotten. Some had missing oars. The crew had not conducted adequate drills. Many did not know how to operate the davits. The ship should never have sailed. The inquiry also found that Captain Gulli had requested a replacement vessel 2 weeks before the disaster. He had sent 2 telegrams to Navigazione Generale Italiana, warning that the Mafalda was in poor condition. The company had ordered him to continue. The board concluded that the company had prioritized profit over safety, that they had ignored warnings, that they had knowingly sent a dangerous ship to sea. The report recommended criminal charges. 6 officers of Navigazione Generale Italiana were indicted. They were charged with negligence and manslaughter. The trials dragged on for 2 years. In the end, 2 were convicted. They received minor sentences, fines, suspended jail time. No one went to prison. The company paid compensation to the victims' families. Approximately 12 million lire. In today's money, something like $40 million. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was all the families would get. The disaster had political consequences. The Italian government, embarrassed by the international attention, pushed for reforms. New regulations were introduced. All passenger ships over 5,000 tons were required to undergo annual inspections, with particular attention to propeller shafts and watertight doors. Lifeboat drills were made mandatory, to be conducted at least once per voyage. Ships over 20 years old were required to be refitted or retired. Navigazione Generale Italiana, facing financial ruin from the lawsuits and the loss of the Mafalda, merged with 2 other lines to form the Italia Flotta Riunite. The new company introduced a fleet of modern liners in the 1930s. The Rex, the Conte di Savoia, ships with double hulls, reinforced bulkheads, safety features learned from the Mafalda's death. The disaster, in other words, had forced change. But change, as always, came too late for those who had needed it most. The wreck of the Principessa Mafalda lies in approximately 300 meters of water, 75 miles off the coast of Bahia. The exact coordinates are 17 degrees south, 37 degrees west. The wreck has never been extensively explored. A Brazilian survey ship located it in 1953 using sonar. The image showed a large intact hull lying on its starboard side. The funnels had collapsed, the masts were gone, but the basic structure was still there. In the 1980s, a diving expedition attempted to reach the wreck. They descended to 200 meters and ran out of air. The wreck was too deep for recreational divers, too remote for commercial salvage. It was left alone. Local fishermen call the area the Princess's Reef. They say the fishing is good there. The wreck has become an artificial reef. Fish gather around it. Coral grows on the hull. Life, as it always does, has reclaimed the dead. There were memorials. In Genoa, a plaque was installed at the Stazione Marittima, listing the names of the victims. In Buenos Aires, the Italian community held a mass every October 25th for 10 years. In Rome, a monument was erected in the Piazza Navona. It was a simple stone, inscribed with the words, "In memory of those lost aboard the Principessa Mafalda." October 25th, 1927. Never forgotten. The monument is still there. Few people notice it. Tourists walk past it every day, on their way to the fountains and the cafes, unaware of what it represents. That is the nature of memorials. They remember. But they do not make us remember. Princess Mafalda of Savoy, the woman for whom the ship was named, died in 1944. She had married a German prince and lived in Germany during the war. When her father, the King of Italy, switched sides in 1943, the Nazis arrested her. She was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. She died there of malnutrition and neglect at the age of 44. When news of her death reached Italy, some newspapers mentioned the ship. "The cursed name," they said, as if the ship and the princess were linked by fate, as if tragedy was something that could be inherited, passed down like a title. It is superstition, of course, but superstition is just pattern recognition without context. The ship sank because of negligence. The princess died because of politics. There is no curse, only the coincidence of suffering, repeated. The survivors carried the disaster with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke about it constantly, others never mentioned it. Teresa Lombardi, the young woman who had been traveling to Argentina for an arranged marriage, stayed in Rio. She never made it to Buenos Aires. She married a Brazilian shopkeeper instead, a man who had helped distribute blankets at the dock when the rescue ships arrived. They had 4 children. She lived to be 83. In interviews late in her life, she said she never went near the ocean again. Not once. She lived 30 miles inland, in a small town in the hills, and when her children asked to go to the beach, she said no. She did not explain why. They knew. Giulio Bellini, the magician, continued performing. He toured South America for another 20 years, doing the same card tricks, the same disappearing coins. But he added something new to his act. At the end of every show, he would stand on stage and tell the story of the Mafalda, how he had helped people into lifeboats, how he had jumped into the sea, how he had survived. It became his signature. People came to see him not for the magic, but for the story. He died in 1949 in a boarding house in Montevideo. He was alone. His belongings were sold to pay for the funeral. Among them was a tuxedo, carefully preserved, still stained with seawater and oil. The tuxedo he had been wearing the night the ship went down. He had kept it for 22 years. Dr. Ernesto Veronese, the ship's physician who had stayed aboard to treat the injured, was one of the last to leave the Mafalda. He had worked on deck until the water was at his knees, setting a broken leg, stitching a gash, administering morphine. When the ship began its final plunge, a steward had physically dragged him to the rail and pushed him over. He had fallen 20 feet into the water and been pulled into a lifeboat by Dutch sailors. He returned to Italy and never practiced medicine again. He opened a bookstore in Naples, small, quiet. He spent his days arranging shelves and recommending novels to customers. He did not talk about the Mafalda. When asked, he would say only, "I was there." And then he would change the subject. He died in 1961. His obituary mentioned the shipwreck in passing, as if it were a minor detail in an otherwise unremarkable life. But those who knew him said he had nightmares until the end, that he would wake in the dark, gasping, convinced he was drowning. The crew members who survived faced a different kind of aftermath. Many were blamed, accused of cowardice, of abandoning passengers, of saving themselves first. Some of the accusations were true. Witnesses reported seeing crew members jumping into lifeboats before women and children had been loaded, rushing the boats, fighting for space. But other witnesses reported the opposite. Crew members staying on deck, helping, organizing, sacrificing themselves. The truth, as always, was complicated. Some crew were heroes, some were not. Most were simply terrified men trying to survive. The Italian inquiry interviewed dozens of crew members. The testimonies were contradictory, confusing. The investigators could not determine a clear narrative. In the end, they issued a vague statement about failures of discipline under extreme stress and moved on. The surviving crew were allowed to return to work, though many never sailed again. The stigma followed them. The whispers. He was on the Mafalda. It was enough to make you unemployable in some ports. The families of the dead faced a bureaucratic nightmare. Navigazione Generale Italiana had agreed to pay compensation, but the process was slow and opaque. Claimants had to prove their relationship to the deceased. They had to provide death certificates, but many of the bodies had never been recovered. How do you prove someone is dead when there is no body? The company demanded documentation, birth certificates, marriage licenses, passenger receipts. Many of the victims had been poor emigrants. They did not have documentation. They had left Italy with nothing but a ticket and a name. Their families, back in Calabria or Sicily, could not prove anything, so they received nothing. The wealthy families, with lawyers and connections, received their payments within a year. The poor families waited. Some waited a decade. Some never received anything. This inequality, this casual cruelty, was not lost on the Italian public. The Mafalda became a symbol not just of disaster, but of injustice, of a system that valued some lives more than others. In Argentina, the disaster reshaped immigration policy. The Argentine government, horrified by the loss of life, pressured Italy to improve safety standards on the South American routes. They threatened to ban Italian ships from Argentine ports unless reforms were made. Italy complied. New ships were built. Old ships were retired. The Mafalda had been the last of a generation. After her sinking, the era of the aging immigrant liner came to an end. The ships that replaced her were faster, safer, more modern, but they were also more expensive. Ticket prices rose. Emigration slowed. The flood of Italians to Argentina, which had peaked in the 1920s, became a trickle in the 30s. The Mafalda had carried thousands of people across the Atlantic in her 19 years of service. Her death closed the door behind them. The disaster also had technical consequences. Marine engineers studied the wreck reports obsessively. The fractured propeller shaft became a case study. How had it happened? Why had no one noticed the wear? The inquiry had found that the bearings were original, installed in 1908. 19 years old. The engineers were appalled. Bearings were supposed to be replaced every 2 to 3 years. The fact that the Mafaldas had lasted 19 was not a testament to quality. It was a miracle, and miracles eventually run out. The failure had been predictable, preventable. The engineers developed new inspection protocols, new materials, new designs. Propeller shafts on passenger ships were reinforced. Bearings were monitored more closely. Bulkheads near the shaft tunnels were strengthened. The changes were implemented across the Italian fleet, and eventually, it crossed the international maritime industry. The Mafalda's death led to innovations that saved countless lives in the decades that followed. But no one who lost someone on the Mafalda found comfort in that. There were also whispers, rumors, conspiracy theories. Some people did not believe the disaster was an accident. They pointed to the gold, 250,000 lire, locked in the ship's safe. What had happened to it? The official story was that it had gone down with the ship, but some survivors claimed they had seen crew members breaking into the safe during the evacuation, loading the gold into a lifeboat, rowing away into the darkness. The rumors were never substantiated. The inquiry found no evidence of theft, but the gold was never recovered. It sits, presumably, in the wreck, 300 meters below the surface, unreachable. Or perhaps it is in a bank vault somewhere, laundered and spent, the proceeds of a disaster. No one knows, and the not knowing feeds the stories. Others whispered about sabotage. The Mafalda had been scheduled to carry political prisoners, anarchists arrested in Genoa, being deported to Argentina. They were not aboard the final voyage. They had been moved to a different ship at the last minute. Why? Some said the anarchists had sabotaged the Mafalda before they were moved, that they had damaged the shaft deliberately, that the sinking was an act of political terrorism. The Italian government investigated. They found nothing. The anarchists had never been near the engine room. They had been held in cells in Genoa until their deportation. The sabotage theory was dismissed, but it persisted. In certain circles, in certain bars in Buenos Aires and Genoa, you can still hear the story. The Mafalda was sunk by anarchists. The government covered it up, believe it or not. Most do not, but some do. Then there are the ghost stories. Ships that sink violently, that take lives, tend to generate them. Fishermen off the coast of Bahia have reported strange things. Lights beneath the water, the sound of voices, calling out in Italian, drifting across the waves at night. A woman in a white gown, standing on the deck of a phantom ship, waving. These are old stories. Common stories. Every shipwreck has them. But they persist because the sea is vast and dark, and we do not fully understand it. Because it is easier to believe in ghosts than to accept that 300 people died for no reason other than poor maintenance and corporate greed. Ghosts give meaning to the meaningless. They suggest that the dead linger, that they have not been forgotten, that they matter. The practical explanation for the lights is bioluminescence. The waters off Brazil are rich with dinoflagellates, organisms that glow when disturbed. A school of fish, a current, a piece of drifting wreckage can all cause them to light up. The voices are likely the wind, moving through rock formations on the coast, creating sounds that resemble human speech. The woman in white is almost certainly a misidentification. A buoy, a floating piece of debris, a trick of the moonlight. But sailors prefer the ghost story. It is more interesting, and after enough time, after enough retellings, the ghost becomes as real as the wreck. The legacy of the Principessa Mafalda is mixed. In Italy, she is remembered as a tragedy, a cautionary tale, a ship that should never have sailed. In Argentina, she is remembered as part of the immigrant experience, one of the vessels that brought thousands of Italians to a new life, and one of the vessels that killed them. In maritime history, she is a footnote. A disaster overshadowed by the Titanic, by the Lusitania, by larger and more famous wrecks. But for those who study maritime safety, the Mafalda is essential. She represents a category of disaster that is often overlooked. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a slow, grinding failure of systems and maintenance and oversight. The kind of disaster that happens not because of bad luck, but because of bad decisions. The ship's name is still invoked. In Italy, when a building collapses due to poor construction, or a bridge fails due to neglected maintenance, people say, "Another Mafalda." It has become shorthand for preventable tragedy, for disasters that happen because someone, somewhere, chose profit over safety, chose convenience over caution. The name carries weight, it carries blame, and it carries memory. In 2007, on the 80th anniversary of the sinking, a memorial service was held in Genoa. Descendants of the victims attended. A priest blessed a wreath and cast it into the harbor. A naval band played the Italian national anthem. A historian gave a speech about the importance of remembering. "We honor the dead," he said, "not by mourning, but by learning." The Mafalda taught us that ships are not invincible, that beauty is not safety, that we must maintain what we build, or it will destroy us. It was a good speech, well-intentioned, but the crowd was small, fewer than 100 people. The disaster, 80 years later, had faded from public consciousness. The survivors were dead. Their children were old. Their grandchildren had other concerns. This is the nature of memory. It decays. Not all at once, but gradually. The sharp edges soften. The details blur. What remains is a story. A name. A date. October 25th, 1927. The Principessa Mafalda. 314 dead. The facts survive. But the feeling, the immediacy, the horror of it, fades. And perhaps that is necessary. Perhaps we cannot carry every tragedy forward. We would collapse under the weight. So we remember selectively. We build monuments and hold services and tell stories. And then we move on. But the wreck remains, 300 meters below the surface. Rusting, dissolving, becoming part of the reef. The fish do not know it was a ship. The coral does not know it was a tragedy. The sea does not remember. It never does. It takes what we give it, our ships and our bodies and our stories, and it absorbs them. And in time, there is nothing left but water. But for now, the Mafalda is still there. A steel tomb. A monument to hubris and neglect. A reminder that the ocean does not forgive. The final lesson of the Principessa Mafalda is this. Disasters are not accidents. They are choices. Someone chose not to replace the bearings. Someone chose not to fix the watertight doors. Someone chose to ignore the captain's warnings. Someone chose profit over people. And 314 people paid the price. This is not unique to the Mafalda. It is the story of almost every disaster. Behind the broken hull, behind the failed engine, behind the sinking ship, there is always a decision, a choice. A person who knew better and did nothing. We like to think of disasters as acts of God. Random, unpredictable. But they are not. They are acts of man, and they are preventable. The Mafalda did not have to sink. The people did not have to die. If the company had maintained the ship, if the bearings had been replaced, if the watertight doors had been repaired, the shaft would not have broken. Or if it had, the ship would not have flooded. She would have stayed afloat. Help was already on the way. The Empire Star was 40 miles away. The Alhina was 60. In calm seas, in daylight, an evacuation could have been managed without a single death. But the ship was not maintained. The doors did not seal, and so the Mafalda sank, and 314 people drowned. This is the dark story of the beautiful Italian Titanic. A ship that was loved. A ship that was elegant. A ship that carried the dreams of emigrants and the wealth of aristocrats. A ship that was allowed to rot from the inside. A ship that killed not because of the sea, not because of fate, not because of bad luck, but because someone decided that a ship's schedule mattered more than a ship's safety. Because someone decided that the cost of repairs was greater than the cost of lives. That is the story. That is the lesson. And if we forget it, if we let the memory decay, then the Mafalda and her dead will have died for nothing. So we remember. We tell the story. We say the name. Principessa Mafalda, October 25th, 1927. 314 dead. We say it not because it is pleasant, not because it is comforting, but because it is true. And because the truth, however dark, is all we have to keep the dead from disappearing completely. The sea may forget, but we do not. We remember, and in remembering we honor those who were lost, not with flowers, not with prayers, but with vigilance, with maintenance, with care, with the simple, unglamorous work of making sure it never happens again. The Mafalda is gone, but her story remains. A ghost of a different kind, not haunting the waves off Brazil, but haunting the industry that killed her, haunting the regulations written in her name, haunting the engineers who study her failure, haunting the descendants who carry her memory. She is there, in the background, whenever a ship sails, a reminder, a warning, a voice from 300 meters down saying, "Do not forget. Do not let this happen again. Maintain what you build. Respect the sea. Value the lives you carry, or you will end up like me, broken, sunken, remembered only for how I died." That is the legacy of the Principessa Mafalda. Not beauty, not elegance, but a lesson written in salt water and steel. A lesson we must never stop learning.